Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that perhaps more than any other has undeniably shaped human history in profound and often devastating ways: war and peace.
Mm.
It's an almost unsettlingly enduring presence, isn't it? Something we find woven into the fabric of virtually all ages, all cultures, all societies, really, from ancient empires right up to our interconnected modern world.
It's quite striking when you think about it that way.
This ubiquity makes you wonder,
Mm.
truly, what is war at its core? Why does it keep occurring? I mean, even after millennia of human development and our persistent hopes for lasting peace,
Yeah,
how has its very nature transformed, especially with the relentless march of technology bringing us, ever more destructive and often more subtle weaponry?
the crucial question.
And perhaps the most difficult, most agonizing question of all, can it ever truly be justified?
Those are indeed the fundamental questions that have, well, haunted philosophers, strategists, and everyday people for centuries. In the realm of modern global politics, military power remains an absolutely key measure of state strength, a fundamental currency of power, if you will.
Right, the ultimate leverage in some ways.
Yet, paradoxically, war itself is the very outcome that much of international diplomacy is explicitly designed to avoid. Think about it. The implicit or explicit threat of war underpins nearly all interactions between states, and increasingly non-state actors too.
Hmm.
It shapes our general ideas about what constitutes world order and how it might be maintained or indeed broken. So our mission today for you is to unpack these incredibly complex, multifaceted questions. We'll be diving deep into the sources you provided, extracting the most vital insights and even some surprising facts to help you become truly well-informed on this absolutely critical subject.
So, to kick things off, let's grapple with that first foundational question. How do we even begin to define something as multifaceted, as chaotic, and as deeply impactful as war? Okay, let's unpack this. What is it that truly distinguishes war from other forms of violence we see in the world, something like murder or organized gang crime or even large-scale riots?
That's an excellent starting point, because without a clear definition, we can't truly analyze its causes or consequences. The first key distinction our sources point to is that war is inherently a conflict between or among political groups.
Political groups. Oh,
This is crucial. It's not just random acts of violence or personal feuds. Historically, and certainly through much of the modern era, this often meant conflicts between states, what we call interstate wars.
right.
You can think of those classic wars of plunder where one state invaded another, perhaps over territory, resources, or even dynastic succession. That was, for a long time, the archetypal form of war between nations.
But what's fascinating and quite a significant shift in recent decades is that interstate war has actually become less common. It seems to have been displaced, or at least overshadowed, by civil wars
Mhm.
and the growing involvement of non-state actors. We're talking about groups like guerrilla movements, resistance movements, or even transnational terrorist organizations.
Absolutely. Their emergence has really complicated our traditional understanding of who fights wars and why.
It really has.
And this leads us to the second distinguishing feature. War is organized. It's not a spontaneous outburst. It's carried out by armed forces or, trained fighters who operate under a command structure with a strategy and often with specific objectives in mind.
So planned action.
Exactly. Conventional warfare, as we've largely understood it for centuries, was a highly organized and disciplined affair. Think of uniformed military personnel, strict drills, rigid ranks, and even attempts to establish laws of war to govern its conduct and hopefully reduce its savagery.
So a clear contrast to random, uncoordinated attacks. But you're hinting that this organized aspect is also evolving, aren't you?
Precisely. Modern warfare has seen a significant trend towards, well, less organized operations, often involving irregular fighters who might be loosely structured or part of local militias.
Right.
These groups may not adhere to those traditional rules of war, which further blurs that critical distinction between military combatants and civilian life, making conflicts far messier and, frankly, more tragic for those caught in the middle.
And then there's the question of scale and magnitude. Our sources emphasize that a few small-scale attacks resulting in a handful of deaths are rarely referred to as a war. The United Nations, for example, defines a major conflict as one in which at least 1,000 deaths occur annually.
That's the benchmark they use.
But even that, as you might imagine, feels a bit arbitrary, doesn't it? It would, for example, exclude the Falklands War of 1982, which is almost universally regarded as a full-blown war between Argentina and the UK, despite having fewer than 1,000 deaths over its entire course.
That's a perfect illustration of how definitions can be slippery.
Yeah.
You can't just stick a number on it and say, that's war.
Exactly. It highlights the difficulty in setting rigid quantitative thresholds for something as qualitative as conflict.
It does. And the final criterion often mentioned is duration. Wars typically involve a series of battles or attacks that take place over a significant period of time rather than just an isolated incident.
Okay.
Now, while some wars can be incredibly short, like the Six-Day War of 1967, where Israel swiftly defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, others are famously protracted.
Uh,
Take the Hundred Years' War,
yes.
which, despite its name, was actually a series of distinct wars and truces between England and France, conventionally dated from 1337 to 1353. So over a century of intermittent conflict.
What's truly fascinating here, and almost unsettling, is the idea that some historians prefer to view the First and Second World Wars not as two entirely separate conflicts,
Right.
but as part of a single, larger, continuous conflict, merely interrupted by a 20-year truce between 1918 and 1939.
It's a compelling reinterpretation, isn't it? Viewing them as one longer conflict suggests that the underlying geopolitical tensions, unresolved grievances, and ideological clashes that led to WWI were never truly settled.
They just festered.
Exactly. They merely simmered beneath the surface, exploding again with even greater ferocity 2 decades later. It fundamentally challenges the idea of distinct, contained conflicts and emphasizes the continuity of strategic struggles.
Hmm.
And this brings us to a crucial point. The very nature of war and warfare has changed enormously over time, always reflecting the technological and economic levels of development of their eras.
And it's fascinating how technology doesn't just change how we fight, but fundamentally alters the very nature of conflict itself. Thinking about that evolution, from the rigid lines and columns of soldiers fighting with smoothbore muskets where accuracy was low and massed fire was key,
Right, very different tactics.
warfare gradually became more flexible and lethal. This evolution saw the advent of rifle barrels, which allowed for greater range and precision, fundamentally changing battlefield engagements.
Huge difference.
Then came the widespread and devastating impact of barbed wire and the machine gun in World War I, turning open battlefields into, well, meat grinders and emphasizing defensive positions.
Absolutely transformed trench warfare.
Later, we saw the development of tanks and extended movement, especially the terrifying speed and coordination of the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War used by the Germans in the Second World War, which bypassed static defenses entirely.
And industrialization truly magnified this. The greater capacity of states to mobilize entire populations and gear their economies towards military ends gave rise to what we call total war in the 20th century.
Total war. That sounds ominous.
It was. The two world wars are the starkest examples. Total war meant the complete dedication of a nation's resources. Widespread conscription pulling nearly all able-bodied men into military service, the entire economy being geared towards military production, converting factories from making cars to tanks, for instance.
Society completely reoriented.
Precisely. And the aim of achieving unconditional surrender through the mass destruction of enemy targets, including industrial centers and, tragically, civilian infrastructure.
Devastating.
Beyond this, we can categorize wars by their scale and the nature of the outcomes at stake. At one extreme, there are hegemonic wars, sometimes called global, general, systemic, or world wars. These involve a range of states mobilizing their full economic and social resources in a struggle to defend or reshape the global balance of power.
Like the World Wars.
Exactly. Historically, these have been the most transformative conflicts, completely altering the global landscape.
Then you have the more constrained conflicts, like limited or regional wars.
Right. These are fought with very specific, limited objectives, such as redrawing boundaries or expelling enemy occupiers, without necessarily seeking the unconditional surrender of the opposing state.
Okay, more focused goals.
A classic example is the 1991 Gulf War, which aimed specifically to expel Iraq from Kuwait after its invasion, not to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime entirely. Or the 1999 U.S.-led NATO bombing of Kosovo, which aimed to expel Serb forces from the province, again with limited, clearly defined goals.
Got it.
And beyond conventional large-scale or limited wars, we see unconventional warfare.
Got it.
This can involve the use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, a terrifying prospect. But it also encompasses what our sources call new wars, which are often synonymous with guerrilla warfare.
Guerrilla warfare, a concept popularized by figures like Ernesto Che Guevara, a key leader of the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. He's sort of the icon for that, isn't he?
He certainly is, and guerrilla warfare is a typical feature of revolutionary wars. These revolutionary wars can manifest as civil conflicts between competing factions within a state. Think of the deep internal divisions and bloodshed during Cuba's struggle against the Batista dictatorship or the Russian Revolution of 1918.
Huge internal upheaval.
Or as anti-colonial struggles, where colonized peoples violently overthrow foreign powers. The Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962 saw the National Liberation Front, or FLN, fight the much larger and better equipped French military, ultimately achieving Algeria's independence after more than a century of French colonial rule.
A long and brutal fight.
It was. And this pattern of revolutionary warfare was absolutely critical in ending European colonialism across many African nations in the 20th century.
We even see this exemplified in the strategic and intellectual leadership of Amilcar Cabral, the founder of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. Cabral was a profound thinker who insisted on the importance of political education and strategic ingenuity for mobilizing both urban and rural populations in a revolutionary struggle.
A really key figure often overlooked.
Despite being a small, inexperienced, and ill-equipped anti-colonial movement, Cabral's PAIGC ultimately defeated Portuguese colonialism in 1974 after 11 grueling years of revolutionary war. This demonstrates how critical strategic and intellectual leadership can be in conflicts that defy conventional military might and resources.
Absolutely. It shows that war isn't just about brute force. Ideas and strategy matter immensely, especially in asymmetrical contexts.
So it's clear then that war isn't a static concept. It's constantly morphing, constantly adapting. But for all its changing forms, one question persists throughout human history. Why, despite all our advancements and our desire for peace, do wars keep breaking out?
It's true that each war is unique, stemming from its own particular set of historical circumstances, a specific trigger, a unique cast of characters, but the fact that war appears to be a historical constant, an almost inevitable part of the human story, has led some theorists to argue there are deeper underlying explanations that apply across all ages and societies.
Right, looking for the root causes.
Exactly. We can frame this through Kenneth Waltz's foundational work, Man, the State in War, from 1959, which categorizes theories into three main levels of analysis, focusing on human nature, the internal characteristics of states, or structural systemic pressures of the international system.
The three images, as he called them.
Precisely. And to these, we can add a more modern societal level of analysis, which looks at how societies themselves might foster conflict.
Okay, let's start with the most common and perhaps most intuitive idea, that war stems from innate human instincts. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides, famous for his account of the Peloponnesian War, for example, argued that war is caused by the lust for power arising from greed and ambition.
A very old idea.
He believed that war is endless because human desires and appetites are infinite, while the resources to satisfy them are always finite. This inherent struggle and competition, he argued, will inevitably express itself in bloodshed and violence.
So it's baked into us, according to him.
Pretty much. And this isn't just an ancient idea. It even finds a kind of scientific support in Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories about the struggle for survival, which social Darwinians like Herbert Spencer developed into the doctrine of the survival of the fittest in social relations.
Applying biology to society.
More recently, evolutionary psychologists, such as the Austrian zoologist Konrad Lorenz, have argued that aggression is biologically programmed, particularly in men, as a result of territorial and sexual instincts found across species.
Lorenz and his geese.
Right. From this perspective, whether war is fought to protect homelands, acquire wealth, achieve glory, advance principles, or establish dominance, it provides a necessary and inevitable outlet for aggressive urges that are simply hardwired into human nature.
And these assumptions do indeed underpin classical realist theories of power politics, which see contention among states as a collective manifestation of individual selfishness and competitiveness playing out on a grand scale.
Makes sense if individuals are inherently driven that way.
However, there are significant drawbacks to purely biological theories of war. They often offer an unbalanced view of human nature, placing too much emphasis on nature, implying human nature is fixed and unchangeable, and too little on nurture.
Okay.
By nurture, we mean the complex range of social, cultural, economic, and political factors that shape human behavior and can profoundly modify or channel instinctual drives.
So it's not just biology.
Far from it.
Yeah.
Furthermore, even if we accept the idea of innate aggression, it by no means proves that large-scale organized warfare with its complex logistical, political, and social structures is inevitable. Small-scale aggression is a far cry from a global conflict.
That's a really important distinction. Which brings us to the societal level, offering a less individualistic or biologically deterministic account. This perspective has emerged recently from the field of critical military studies, or CMS, and it argues that rather than human nature or biology, it is the process of socialization into militarism that actually produces war.
Interesting. So how does that work?
Well, take Victoria Basham, a leading CMS scholar who has explored how social practices and traditions of war commemoration are deeply embedded in what she calls racialized and gendered discourses.
Okay.
From this viewpoint, commemorative and other patriotic practices, like the slogan, "We support our troops," or the wearing of commemorative symbols, or even the building of statues of fallen soldiers, are about reproducing the conditions for war.
How so?
If successive generations are socialized to venerate warriors, to see militarism as natural and right, and very often as a core part of masculinity and national patriotism, then they will be better placed to support or even participate in future wars. It's about how society normalizes the idea of war.
So CMS fundamentally aims to demystify and denaturalize war, revealing how its causes are rooted in power relations and social reproduction within societies. It takes a deconstructionist stance, questioning assumptions rather than taking military power or the necessity of war for granted.
Got it. It challenges the taken for granted aspects.
Exactly. Now, shifting to the state level, a third range of theories suggests that war is best explained by the internal characteristics of political actors, the type of government, its political culture. Liberals, for instance, have long argued that a state's constitutional and governmental arrangements incline some towards aggression, while others favor peace.
This sounds like the democratic peace idea.
Precisely. This is most clearly reflected in the influential democratic peace thesis, which posits that democratic states generally do not go to war against one another. The argument is that shared values, peaceful dispute resolution mechanisms, and mutual respect for human rights between democracies make armed conflict between them highly unlikely.
In contrast, authoritarian and imperialist states, from a liberal perspective, are seen as intrinsically inclined towards militarism and war.
Why is that?
Well, the argument goes that such regimes often rely heavily on armed forces to maintain domestic order, especially in the absence of representative processes, and through the need to subdue subordinate national or ethnic groups within their borders.
Okay, internal control relies on the military?
Right.
This reliance often leads to a fusion of political and military elites, a glorification of the armed forces as a symbol of national strength, and a political culture shaped by an almost atavistic belief in heroism and self-sacrifice for the state. In these contexts, war becomes not only a legitimate instrument of policy, but also an expression of national patriotism and unity. A stark contemporary example of this, as our sources point out, would be Vladimir Putin's Russia, which has waged war in Ukraine since 2014, escalating to all-out war in 2022.
And that's been supported by strong, pro-war patriotic narratives within Russia, alongside systematic repression of anti-war protests, painting the conflict as a necessary defense of national identity. It fits that pattern.
It certainly seems to.
Then there's the radical state-centric explanation offered by the historical sociologist Charles Tilly, whose famous claim is that war made the state and the state made war.
I've heard that phrase. What's the idea behind it? Tilly's meticulous analysis of 1,000 years of European history showed that states were actually formed through and in preparation for war. The escalating costs and sophistication of armed conflict, from medieval knights to gunpowder armies, demanded new systems of taxation, bureaucracy, and centralized control.
Ah, the infrastructure of the state.
Exactly. All features that would become the hallmarks of the European nation-state. So from this view, war-making remains a central, almost intrinsic feature of all states, because in a fundamental sense, they were designed to do it, to extract resources and organize violence on a large scale.
Wow. So war is almost in the DNA of the state itself.
That's Tilly's argument, in essence.
And finally, we zoom out to the structural level, looking at systemic pressures within the international system itself. The most influential theory here is the neorealist assertion that war is an inevitable consequence of an anarchic international system, meaning there's no overarching world government or authority to enforce rules.
Right, the lack of a global 9/11.
Exactly. This lack of central authority forces states to rely on self-help for their security. In its gloomiest form, as advanced by offensive realists, who believe states seek to maximize power rather than just security.
Not just survival, but dominance.
Right. This suggests that international relations are destined always to be characterized by a restless struggle for advantage, with military conflict being an unavoidable fact of life. This tendency is further accentuated by the concept of the security dilemma, where fear and uncertainty lead states to interpret defensive actions by others as potentially or actually offensive.
Prompting a cycle of arms races and distrust.
Hmm.
You build a shield, I think it's a sword, so I build a bigger sword.
And it escalates.
For realists, the only way war can be permanently banished from the international system is through the establishment of a world government and thus the abolition of anarchy. But they regard this as both highly improbable, given the sovereignty of states, and potentially dangerous, as a single global power could become tyrannical.
A cure worse than the disease, perhaps.
Potentially, in their view. Other structural theories place a heavier emphasis on economic factors. Marxists, for instance, view war as a direct consequence of the international dynamics of the capitalist system.
How so?
They argue that capitalist states will inevitably come into conflict as each is forced to expand, hoping to maintain profit levels by gaining control over new markets, securing raw materials, or exploiting supplies of cheap labor overseas. All wars, from this perspective, are essentially wars of plunder carried out in the interests of the capitalist class,
The profit motive driving conflict.
implying that socialism, by removing profit motives, is the best guarantee of peace. Think of thinkers like Noam Chomsky, who often critiques what he sees as hegemonic wars driven by economic interests.
On the other hand, the liberal economic view often sees the impulse to war stemming from economic nationalism and autarky, or self-sufficiency.
Okay, trying to go it alone economically.
Exactly. This pursuit of self-sufficiency inclines states towards protectionist policies, hindering free trade, and ultimately leading towards colonialism, as states sought exclusive control over resources and markets. This, in turn, deepens economic rivalry and makes war more likely.
However, it's worth noting that economic theories of war have become, perhaps, less influential since 1945, largely because trade has been widely accepted as a more reliable path to prosperity than expansionism and conquest.
The rise of global trade.
Indeed. In fact, economic pressures have increasingly encouraged interdependence and integration through global supply chains and financial systems, which are now often seen to weaken the impulse to war rather than fuel it.
Because conflict disrupts that interdependence.
Precisely. When nations are deeply intertwined economically, the cost of conflict becomes prohibitive for both sides, creating a powerful disincentive for large-scale war.
Okay, that makes sense. With all these varied explanations for why wars occur, from deep-seated human instincts to the very structure of the global system, one particular theory stands out for its enduring influence and perhaps its most profound impact on how we understand war: the Clausewitzian view.
Clausewitz.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and military theorist, put forth a seminal idea in his masterwork On War, published posthumously in 1832. War is merely a continuation of politics, or policy, by other means.
Politics by other means. That phrase echoes through history. This statement is incredibly profound because it reframes our entire understanding of war. It implies that war is not some random, chaotic outburst of violence, but rather a rational, calculated means to a political end, fundamentally, a policy instrument.
So war as a tool in the political toolbox.
Exactly. It emphasizes a continuity between war and peace. Both are characterized by the rational pursuit of self-interest, differing only in the means chosen to achieve one's goals. States go to war, according to Clausewitz, when they calculate it's in their interest to do so, when diplomacy or other means have failed or become less effective.
A cost-benefit analysis, essentially.
This aligns perfectly with the realist view of war as a tool of state policy. Clausewitz himself, after serving in the Prussian military and studying the philosophy of Kant, developed this Trinitarian theory of warfare involving three dynamic forces: the primordial violence of the masses motivated by national animosity, the play of probability and chance that defines the army's strategy, and the rational calculations of political leaders establishing aims and objectives.
The people, the army, the government.
That's the Trinity. He's widely regarded as the greatest writer on military theory and war.
And historically, this concept was particularly attractive in the 19th century when wars were predominantly interstate, fought by professional armies, and their costs were, well, more limited and calculable compared to later conflicts. It seemed to offer a clear, logical framework.
It did. Yet, despite its colossal influence, the Clausewitzian conception of war has attracted growing criticism, particularly as warfare has evolved. Some of these criticisms are moral in character. Clausewitz has been condemned for presenting war as a normal and inevitable condition, one that can be justified by narrow state interests rather than wider principles like justice.
So accused of normalizing war.
In a sense, yes. This suggests that if war serves legitimate political purposes, its moral implications can be ignored. However, there's a fascinating paradox here. Had Clausewitz's suggestion that recourse to war should be based on rational analysis and careful calculation been followed more consistently, many modern wars might actually have been avoided, or at least fought with more restraint.
Interesting point. So rationality could actually limit war.
That's the potential paradox. Other criticisms emphasize that his view is simply outdated, perhaps relevant to the Napoleonic era, but not to modern warfare. First, contemporary economic and political circumstances may dictate that war is a less effective and perhaps even an obsolete policy instrument.
Is war still useful?
That's the question. If modern states are rationally disinclined to resort to war because the economic and social costs are too high, military power might even become irrelevant in world affairs, as some scholars like Martin Van Creveld and Colin Gray have argued. Second, the advent of industrialized and total war has made calculations about the likely costs and benefits much less reliable. If war means mass destruction and societal mobilization, it may no longer be an appropriate means to achieve political ends without risking existential damage to the aggressor as well.
The stakes are just too high.
Exactly. Finally, most criticisms of Clausewitz highlight fundamental changes in the very nature of war that make his paradigm less applicable. This raises a crucial question. To what extent are modern wars post-Clausewitzian?
Post-Clausewitzian. That question leads us directly to a major debate about how war has changed, particularly in the post-Cold War era. Are interstate wars a thing of the past? It's a bold claim.
It is.
Mary Kaldor's New Wars thesis, for instance, introduced the idea of new, postmodern, post-Clausewitzian, or even post-Westphalian wars, referencing the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia that solidified the state-centric international system.
Right, challenging that old state-based model.
These wars, Kaldor argues, tend to exhibit some distinct features. The first characteristic is that they are predominantly civil wars rather than traditional interstate wars. Our sources highlight a striking statistic. About 95% of armed conflicts since the mid-1980s have occurred within states, not between them.
That's a dramatic shift, a huge majority. While there have been recent exceptions, of course, like the Iran-Iraq War, Russia's war with Georgia in 2008, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and the major Russia-Ukraine war that began in 2022.
Important exceptions, certainly.
The overall trend has been a measurable decline in interstate war. This decline is attributed to a combination of factors. The global spread of democracy, which tends to reduce conflict between democratic states, increasing globalization and economic interdependence, making war economically unfeasible.
We just discussed that.
Changing moral attitudes to war, often linked to the UN's role in promoting peace, and crucially, the devastating potential of nuclear weapons, which make large-scale interstate war a catastrophic risk.
The nuclear deterrent.
Absolutely. On the other hand, civil wars have become far more common, particularly in the post-colonial world, where the legacy of colonialism often left behind deep-seated ethnic or tribal rivalries, pervasive economic underdevelopment, and weak state power.
Creating instability.
Leading to what are sometimes termed quasi-states or failed states, governments that struggle to exercise control over their own territory, often leading to internal power vacuums and widespread lawlessness ripe for internal conflict.
So second, in these new wars, issues of identity are usually very prominent, often becoming the core of the conflict. It's not just about territory or resources, but about competing ethnic, religious, or tribal identities.
Identity politics fueling violence.
Third, these wars are frequently asymmetrical, meaning they pit industrially advanced and militarily sophisticated states against enemies that appear to be third-rate in terms of conventional military might.
David versus Goliath, militarily speaking.
Think of U.S.-led wars in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Russia's brutal war against Chechnya. Asymmetrical wars often involve military strategies and tactics designed to level the playing field between opponents with vastly different military and economic capabilities, making their outcomes far from assured.
Right, the weaker side adapts. Guerrilla warfare, for example, emphasizes maneuver, surprise, and small-scale raids and ambushes to defeat better-resourced enemies with greater firepower.
Using agility against strength.
This is often supplemented by terrorist tactics, like roadside bombs and suicide attacks, aiming not for outright military defeat, but to demoralize the enemy and break its political will, or simply to gain international attention.
A different kind of objective.
And fourth, a critical characteristic of new wars is the blurring of the civilian-military distinction. Historically, since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century and the rise of professional armies, there was a relatively clear divide between combatants and civilians.
That line seems much harder to maintain now.
It does. This was easier to respect when warfare was largely confined to battlefields and strictly military personnel. However, modern wars increasingly impact civilian populations, often disproportionately. This is partly due to the diffuse nature of modern conflict, which involves a succession of small-scale engagements rather than set-piece battles, making the traditional battlefield concept almost redundant.
The battlefield is everywhere.
War has essentially developed into war amongst the people, as Rupert Smith observed in 2006, where the front lines are everywhere and the civilian population becomes the environment of conflict. The blurring also occurs because civilian populations are now increasingly targeted by both state military forces and non-state militant and terrorist groups, often leading to massive refugee crises and immense human suffering.
And the very nature of armies and security forces has changed too, right? Guerrilla armies consist of irregular soldiers or armed bands of volunteers, and insurgency often takes on the character of a popular uprising, blurring who is a combatant and who is a civilian.
Exactly. And here's a crucial detail that really exemplifies this shift. The rise of mercenaries and private military contractors continues to be an important feature of armed conflict.
Private armies, essentially.
Pretty much. The Iraq War, for instance, was arguably the most privatized war in history, with more private military contractors working for companies like Blackwater, later Academi and Halliburton, than regular soldiers by mid-2007.
More contractors than soldiers. Wow.
It's a striking statistic. There's even a specific anecdote from 2004 where Blackwater apparently assumed command and control over U.S. Marines in Najaf, highlighting how these private entities sometimes operated outside traditional military chains of command.
That's problematic,
to say the least. And in 2015, an Australian and 6 Colombian mercenaries, allowed to be contracted via Academi to the UAE to fight in Yemen's civil war, were killed in action. This shows the global reach and tangible presence of these non-state actors in modern conflicts.
So not just state armies anymore.
Definitely not. This all feeds into the wider debate. Are interstate wars truly a thing of the past? One argument for yes is the absence of formal declarations of war in many recent conflicts. The United States, for instance, hasn't formally declared war since World War II.
Right, they're operations or interventions.
Exactly. Meaning its conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan, and dozens of counterinsurgency operations were all undeclared. This frames them not as wars against states, but against particular governments, leaders, or non-state groups, shifting the legal and political framing.
Clever framing.
We also see the prevalence of proxy wars, where confrontations between states play out indirectly, arming and supporting factions in other countries, as in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, or more recently in the First Ivorian Civil War, or even the 2022 Russia-Ukraine War, which the Russian foreign minister himself called a proxy war, given the significant arms support from the US and UK to Ukraine.
Fighting through others.
The rise of civil war and counterinsurgency further supports this, with wars against sub-state actors being more common than traditional interstate conflicts. And the increased role of non-state actors, from insurgencies and militant groups like ISIS to private military and security companies who can now fulfill almost all roles that state violence once did, certainly suggests a shift away from traditional interstate conflict.
But there's a strong argument for no, that interstate wars are not a thing of the past, merely disguised.
So what's the counter-argument?
One point is that what's often framed as regime change is still, in essence, interstate war. Powerful states, including the US and Russia, may call their operations counterinsurgency or humanitarian missions, but when they involve the invasion, occupation, and defeat of sovereign state forces, it still functions as interstate conflict.
So the label changes, but the action is similar.
Exactly. The discursive framing simply becomes more important than the reality of the military action. And then there's what's been called the return of history, where resurgent great powers like China and Russia are increasingly moving towards more traditional expressions of state military power.
Back to old school geopolitics.
It looks that way. China's hardening stance over Hong Kong and Taiwan, suggesting the potential use of force to reassert territorial control, and Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine with explicit goals of annexation and regime change clearly demonstrate that traditional interstate warfare, with its classic objectives, is far from obsolete. We might be seeing a resurgence rather than a disappearance.
So while the form of conflict certainly changes, and the actors involved become more diverse, the underlying dynamics of state power and geopolitical competition might still be very much at play.
Seems plausible.
And this brings us to how technology has always shaped this evolution. Clausewitz famously observed that every age has its own kind of war, and from the longbow to the machine gun and nuclear weapons, changes to warfare are often rooted in technological innovations.
Technology driving change. Always.
Since the 1990s, particularly led by the United States, we've seen what's called a revolution in military affairs, or RMA. This involves increasingly ubiquitous new technologies, smart bombs, guided weapons and drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles which can conduct surveillance or strikes without putting human pilots at risk.
Drones are everywhere now. The implications of this are significant. These innovations have reduced the need for conventional ground forces to face off directly in large-scale battles, and consequently, they've reduced casualties, at least for the better-equipped side.
A key point for the better-equipped side.
These postmodern wars continue to be characterized by asymmetry, as seen in the 1991 Gulf War, the counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan after 2001, and the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, where one side possesses overwhelming technological superiority. But beyond just high-tech asymmetry, these conflicts have also taken on a hybrid character.
Indeed. Hybrid warfare involves the complex, simultaneous use of unconventional tactics alongside conventional armed force, often blurring the lines of engagement and attribution.
Making it harder to know who's doing what.
Exactly. A key example is Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. While Russia did deploy conventional cross-border artillery shelling against Ukrainian forces in support of pro-Russia separatists, it also used a range of unconventional methods.
Like what?
This included economic tools, such as strategically controlling Ukraine's gas supplies, and the deployment of disguised special forces, often referred to as little green men or highly trained separatist fighters, widely believed to be Russian special forces wearing generic camouflage, denying official Russian involvement.
Plausible deniability.
Russia denied direct involvement, but photographic evidence clearly linked individual irregular fighters in Crimea to the 2008 Georgia War, where they were in Russian uniform. This covert involvement was complemented by significant cyber attacks.
And cyber warfare is another fascinating and deeply impactful dimension that Clausewitz could never have envisioned. The internet itself, ironically, is a product of military technological innovation.
Started with DARPA, right?
That's right. The U.S. Department of Defense developing ARPANET in the 1970s to advance communications technologies for war. Today, network military computers, often using secure satellite communications, communicate intercontinentally with drones and provide near-instantaneous audiovisual links between troops and leaders in the field.
But the internet has also become a new battleground for cyber warfare, offering novel avenues for attack. Pro-Russia hackers, widely believed to be state-backed, targeted the Ukrainian Central Election Commission in 2014, attempting to change election results on the eve of the presidential election.
Wow, trying to manipulate an election outcome.
Although detected, this was one of many cyber warfare tactics aimed at destabilizing the country. Another dimension is social media influencing. Spreading propaganda through automated bot accounts and fake news, a phenomenon well documented in Crimea in 2014 and controversially linked to alleged Russian influence in the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Information warfare.
Absolutely. And Western states are also involved with Stuxnet, a worm computer virus widely believed to be developed by U.S. defense agencies, causing physical damage to Iranian uranium enrichment centrifuges in 2010.
Physical damage from software.
That's what makes it so significant. This showcases how cyberspace offers new opportunities for remotely developed software to cause physical hardware damage thousands of miles away, akin to conventional sabotage, but with a new, insidious reach.
That's genuinely unnerving.
These changes, combined with the rise of drone warfare and the resurgence of private military companies, mean wars are becoming harder to explain, understand, and predict, and in some respects, ironically, easier to wage without the traditional costs of boots on the ground.
Easier to start, perhaps.
Potentially. This shift potentially makes the abolition of war, a hope for pacifists, less likely, as the threshold for engaging in conflict might appear lower. But how effective have these postmodern wars actually proved to be?
Good question.
Initial successes, like the 1991 Gulf War and the Kosovo intervention, certainly suggested high effectiveness for limited goals. The U.S.'s massive lead in high-tech weaponry has also been vital in consolidating its global military predominance.
However, as in the past, advances in technology and military strategy haven't always easily translated into increased strategic effectiveness in achieving long-term political objectives.
Right. Technology isn't everything. One reason is that air power alone rarely wins wars outright. Examples from the 1940-41 Blitz on London, the devastating 1945 Allied bombing of Dresden, or even Israel's air attacks on Hezbollah in 2006 and Hamas in 2008 demonstrate that aerial assaults seldom entirely eliminate the need for ground forces.
Still need boots on the ground eventually.
Often, yes, to secure objectives and often come at a terrible civilian cost. In fact, they can sometimes even strengthen the enemy's resolve, turning public opinion against the attacker. The Kosovo bombing campaign, for instance, was initially planned for 3 days, but ended up lasting 78 days as the enemy proved resilient.
So air power has limits.
Significant limits. The other significant limitation is that high-tech warfare is of only limited value in small-scale, low-intensity conflicts, especially when the enemy is highly mobile and difficult to distinguish from the civilian population, as often happens in insurgencies.
The guerrilla warfare problem again?
Exactly.
Okay.
The U.S.'s shock and awe assault on Baghdad in the early days of the Iraq War may have quickly toppled Saddam Hussein, but it certainly didn't prevent the development of a protracted and highly complex counterinsurgency war that lasted for years.
Which leads us directly to the rise and fall of counterinsurgency. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, often called the Wars of 9/11, initially seemed to hold promise for swift, decisive victories using advanced technology. However, they quickly escalated into bloody insurgencies that the U.S. and its allies struggled to understand or contain.
A very difficult transition.
This eventually led to a shift in military strategy, with the adoption of a counterinsurgency, or COIN, approach. In Iraq, this was famously associated with the 2007 surge of over 20,000 additional U.S. troops, aiming to take on the enemy at its own game by focusing on population protection, improving governance, and winning local loyalties, essentially a hearts and minds strategy. A similar surge took place in Afghanistan in 2009.
But over time, counterinsurgency has somewhat fallen out of favor. The ultimate failure of the surge in Afghanistan realized when the U.S. withdrew all troops and the Taliban swiftly returned to power in 2021.
A dramatic collapse.
Along with the ongoing instability and complex challenges in Iraq, is seen by many as strong evidence of COIN's inherent weaknesses and limitations. COIN is not a strict universal strategy, but rather a collection of tactics highly dependent on the nature of the specific insurgency it confronts.
It has to be tailored.
And insurgents are often more flexible, tactically astute, and sensitive to the needs of the local population than a foreign counterinsurgency army can ever be. Furthermore, COIN is fundamentally a political strategy, which only succeeds by winning popular support and weakening popular support for the insurgency.
Politics, not just military tactics.
Yet, it is often overseen by military commanders whose political skills and long-term commitment may be limited compared to local leaders. But perhaps the greatest drawback of counterinsurgency warfare is its immense cost, both economically and in human lives.
It's incredibly resource-intensive.
Winning a hearts and minds struggle for civilian loyalties cannot happen overnight. It is a slow, grinding process that requires deploying large numbers of forces whose presence within local communities makes them incredibly vulnerable to attack and resentment.
A long, hard slog.
The chief lesson of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, therefore, may well be that boots-on-the-ground warfare, particularly prolonged counterinsurgencies, should be avoided in the future by powerful states, perhaps pushing them towards less direct forms of intervention.
So, technology and strategy continue to evolve, reshaping the face of war. But no matter how war changes, the biggest, most agonizing questions about it often come down to morality. Can war, with all its inherent destruction and suffering, ever truly be justified?
These debates about justification are truly much more enduring than any particular technology or strategy, dating back to ancient Rome and including medieval philosophers like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. Broadly, 3 distinct positions have been adopted on this complex issue.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's realpolitik, which suggests that war, as a cold, hard political act, needs no moral justification beyond the national interest. Second, we have just war theory, which holds that war can be justified only if it conforms to specific, rigorous moral principles. And third, pacifism, which argues that war, as an unnecessary and inherently evil act, can never be justified in any circumstances.
Right, the 3 main camps. Let's start with realpolitik. Its defining feature is that matters of war and peace are considered to be beyond morality. They are or should be determined solely by the unsentimental pursuit of national self-interest.
Morality doesn't enter the equation.
From this viewpoint, war is accepted as a universal norm of human history, an inevitable part of the international landscape. Though peace may occur for long periods, it's always seen as temporary, a brief interlude between conflicts.
Peace is just the absence of war for them.
Pretty much. The bias for fighting an armed conflict for realpolitik practitioners usually derives either from innate human aggression or the aggression that arises from the fundamental mismatch between unlimited human appetites and scarce resources. Either way, this implies, at best, a belief in negative peace, simply the absence of war or active violence, rather than a more profound state of harmony.
It's a common misconception to portray political realists as warmongers who are unconcerned about the death and devastation war wreaks. In fact, many realists are deeply pragmatic and seek to limit conflict.
Oh, that's interesting.
For example, Carl Schmitt, a controversial German legal and political theorist, actually argued against just wars precisely because he believed their expansive goals and moral fervor often led to total war, where all limits are abandoned in the pursuit of righteous victory.
Because morality makes wars more brutal.
That was his fear. In contrast, he thought wars fought for clear political gain tended to be limited by precise strategic objectives and rational calculations of interest. Realists often criticize utopian liberal dreams of perpetual peace because they're based on fundamental misunderstandings about international politics and the unchanging nature of power.
They see liberals as naive.
Often, yes. They argue that such idealism ironically makes war more likely, not less, by fostering complacency. Think of the interwar period in the 1930s, where UK and French policymakers, arguably deluded by liberal internationalism and a belief in collective security, failed to take decisive action to prevent the reemergence of Nazi Germany as an expansionist power.
Arguably contributing to the outbreak of World War II.
Exactly. The essence of realpolitik, then, is that it's better to be hard-headed and pragmatic than wrong-headed and idealistic. From this perspective, the sole reliable way of maintaining peace is through a balance of power, acknowledging that only power can check power.
Power balancing power.
And it's important to nuance this. Realpolitik isn't necessarily amoral, but rather an example of moral relativism, an ethical nationalism that places national self-interest and survival above universal moral principles. Its enemy is the notion of a universal morality that applies equally to all states, not morality itself.
Okay, so it's a different kind of morality focused on the nation. Despite these nuances, realpolitik has faced severe criticism. First, its assumptions about power politics, inherent conflict, greed, and violence tend to legitimize war and the use of force by making them appear to be part of the natural order of things, making war seem inevitable rather than a choice.
It risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Feminist theorists, for their part, argue that this emphasis on national interest in military might reflect an essentially masculinist view of international politics, deeply rooted in myths about man the warrior and aggressive competition, as scholars like Jean Bethke Elshtain and J.N. Tickner have highlighted.
A gendered critique.
Second, in view of the sheer devastation and suffering that war wreaks on human lives, on societies, and on the environment, the assertion that matters of war and peace are beyond universal morality reflects, for many, a remarkable stunting of ethical sensibilities.
It can seem ethically blind to the consequences.
This is why most thinking about when war can be justified focuses on how the resort to war and its conduct can be reconciled with morality, typically through the notion of a just war.
Just war theory, then, occupies the ethical middle ground between realpolitik and pacifism. It's based on the assumption that war can be justified, but only if it meets specific, demanding ethical criteria.
So war isn't always wrong, but it needs a very good reason.
Precisely. It's more a field of philosophical reflection than a settled doctrine, with origins dating back to Roman thinkers like Cicero and systematically developed by figures like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, for example, identified 3 core conditions for a war to be just. It should be declared by a legitimate authority, have a just cause, and be fought with right intention.
The classic criteria.
Modern contributors include Michael Walzer, whose work, Just and Unjust Wars, is foundational, Jean Bethke Elshtain, and David Rodin. Just war thinking operates on 2 key assumptions. First, that human nature is an unchangeable mixture of good and evil, implying that war is, unfortunately, an inevitable part of the human condition.
Accepting war's reality.
And second, that the suffering war causes can be significantly ameliorated by subjecting warfare to moral constraints and the laws of war. Its ultimate purpose, therefore, is to reestablish peace and justice, not simply to win. World War II, particularly the Allied effort against Nazi Germany, is often identified as the classic example of a just war in modern history.
The good war narrative. Okay, just war theory actually addresses two separate but closely related issues known by their Latin terms. First, there's jus ad bellum, which refers to the right to go to war in the first place, setting the conditions for initiation.
The justice of war.
Its principles include last resort, meaning all nonviolent options like diplomacy or sanctions must be exhausted before military action is considered necessary.
Have we tried everything else?
Just cause, which usually means self-defense against a clear military attack or to prevent large-scale atrocities. Legitimate authority, meaning the war must be declared by a lawfully constituting government of a sovereign state. Right intention with morally acceptable aims, not revenge or territorial expansion.
What are we really fighting?
A reasonable prospect of success to avoid pointless bloodshed. And proportionality, where the expected good from the war should outweigh the anticipated evil or suffering. That's just ad bellum.
A high bar to clear before starting a war.
Indeed. Second, there's jus in bello, which governs the just conduct of war once it has begun.
Justice in war. How we fight.
Its principles are discrimination, meaning force, must be directed at military targets only, with civilians being innocent and protected. Proportionality again. But here, meaning the force used must not be greater than what is strictly needed for the military outcome or to respond to the provoking cause.
Using minimum necessary force.
And humanity, meaning no force against captured, wounded, or controlled enemy personnel, such as prisoners of war, who must be treated according to international conventions. These principles have been formalized over time into the laws of war, codified in international treaties.
While these branches ideally complement one another, their application raises complex debates and practical difficulties. It's often unclear if all conditions must be fulfilled for a war to be just, or if a substantial number suffice, leading to moral ambiguities.
Gray areas.
Lots of them. There's also debate over which conditions take priority. For instance, does just cause always trump last resort? And some argue that the principles of jus ad bellum have greater moral weight than jus in bello, suggesting that a truly just cause might, in extreme circumstances, justify morally difficult means.
Do the ends justify the means? That age-old question.
Exactly. In practice, these principles pose significant challenges. For example, the last resort principle fails to account for situations where delaying force might actually strengthen an enemy, arguably as happened with Nazi Germany in the rearmament of the 1930s.
Waiting could be worse.
The just cause principle becomes complicated by questions of retaliation versus preemptive or preventative attacks. And the reasonable prospect of success is increasingly difficult to apply in new wars, where the enemy is often diffuse and unconventional, and calculations based on relative power are notoriously unreliable.
Hard to predict outcomes. And there are even deeper criticisms of just war theory. For starters, it's fundamentally questioned whether any war has ever truly complied with all its rules. Even in a good war, like World War II, which is often held up as the paragon.
The moral benchmark.
The British used saturation bombing against German cities like Dresden, which had no clear military importance, purely to terrorize civilians and break morale. The war against Japan ended with atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, overwhelmingly killing civilians.
Actions hard to reconcile with jus in bello.
Many argue that modern warfare, with its inherent destructiveness, simply makes it impossible to avoid harming non-combatants, rendering the ideal of a just war irrelevant in practice. Second, attempts to apply these principles can sometimes lead to the wrong outcome from a strategic perspective.
How so?
A party fighting for a just cause might face defeat because it's fighting with its hands tied, so to speak, by jus in bello principles that forbid certain effective but morally questionable tactics. This raises the dirty hands problem, as Michael Walzer discussed with his ticking bomb scenario, where a morally problematic action like torture is considered to prevent a greater evil.
The tough choices in extreme situations.
It forces us to ask if, in the horrific reality of war, clean hands are even possible. Third, just war thinking may only be applicable when parties to a dispute share similar cultural and moral beliefs, allowing one side to be deemed just and the other unjust.
But what if they don't share values?
Exactly. Many modern conflicts, especially those fought under the banner of the War on Terror, are cross-cultural, even civilizational struggles, where both sides legitimately claim justice based on fundamentally incompatible value systems, making objective moral judgment incredibly difficult.
This brings us to a specific case study that highlights these tensions. The war in Afghanistan as a just war. Arguments for it being a just war included self-defense following the devastating 9/11 attacks, and the imperative of protecting the West from apocalyptic terrorism that made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants.
A clear just cause argument initially.
The war also had a clear stated goal, removing the Taliban regime due to its undisputed links with al-Qaeda, which was responsible for 9/11. The United States and its allies were seen as legitimate authorities backed by NATO and wide international support, including initial backing from Russia and China at the UN.
International backing seems strong.
And finally, diplomacy or nonviolent pressure couldn't reliably neutralize the 9/11 perpetrators, as the UN lacked the capability or will to respond effectively to such a novel threat. So, arguably, last resort.
Okay, that's the case for it being just. However, critics presented powerful arguments against its justification even at its outset. First, they questioned the war's true purpose and intentions, suggesting the U.S. was motivated not just by self-defense, but by a desire to consolidate global hegemony or control oil resources,
Questioning the right intention.
thus making the intervention unwarranted aggression driven by less than pure intentions. Second, unlike the 1991 Gulf War, the Afghan War lacked a specific UN Security Council resolution, which raised questions about its legitimate authority under international law.
Legal ambiguity there.
Third, while toppling the Taliban was likely, critics questioned the prospect of success in truly defeating Islamist terrorists in the long run, arguing that the invasion might inflame Muslim opinion and that technological superiority would be limited against guerrilla tactics and a deeply entrenched ideology.
Doubts about reasonable prospect of success.
Fourth, there were clear violations of warfare conventions during the conflict, including the treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and the significant civilian deaths from airstrikes and ground operations.
Issues with Jess and Bello.
Fifth, Islamists themselves claimed justice was on their side, engaging in a jihad or holy war to protect Islam from foreign influence and what they perceived as Western aggression.
Competing claims of justice again.
Finally, and perhaps most decisively in the long view, the ultimate failure. With the U.S. troop withdrawal and the Taliban's swift return to power in 2021,
The end game.
calls into question whether 20 years of war and 241,000 lives lost by some estimates can truly be justified if the primary goal, removing an unjust regime and establishing a stable alternative, ultimately failed in the end. It forces a profound reevaluation.
This complex, often tragic reality leads us to the third broad position. Pacifism, which views war and morality as fundamentally irreconcilable. Pacifism, simply put, is the belief that all war is morally wrong, regardless of the circumstances or stated intentions.
War is never okay.
That's the core belief. This stance rests on two main lines of thought. The first is that war is wrong, because killing is wrong, a principled, absolute rejection based on the sanctity of life, the inherent value of every human being.
Life is sacred.
This is often rooted in deep religious conviction, as seen with groups like the Quakers, the nonviolence philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, or the core tenets of Buddhism and Jainism. This provides the profound moral basis for conscientious objection to military service, a personal refusal to participate in violence.
Refusing to fight on principle.
The second line of argument, sometimes called contingent pacifism, emphasizes the wider and often longer-term benefits of nonviolence for human well-being, arguing that it's a more effective path to lasting peace.
Nonviolence works better in the long run.
That's the idea. From this perspective, violence is never a solution because it inherently breeds more violence, fostering a self-perpetuating psychology of hatred, bitterness, and revenge that makes true reconciliation impossible. This has been powerfully demonstrated by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement in the United States in the 1960s, where nonviolence derived its profound force from its moral purity and its ability to expose injustice.
The power of nonviolent resistance.
Pacifism has significantly influenced international politics in two main ways. First, as legal pacifism, it has strongly supported the establishment of supranational bodies like the League of Nations and the United Nations, aiming for peaceful dispute resolution through international law and collective security.
Building institutions for peace.
For this reason, pacifists have been strong advocates for a world federation or even world government, believing it's the only way to truly abolish war. They embrace the notion of positive peace, not just the mere absence of war, but the absence of its underlying causes, linking peace to social justice, economic equality, and human rights.
Addressing the root causes.
Second, pacifism has fueled the emergence of a growing, albeit disparate, peace movement. This activism first emerged powerfully in response to the nuclear era, with groups like European Nuclear Disarmament, ANND, and the UK-based Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, reflecting the profound shift in understanding the human cost of warfare, the realization that a nuclear war could end humanity.
The nuclear threat galvanized people.
Support for these groups surged after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, pushing for arms control, and more recently, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work on the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Pacifism has also strengthened anti-war movements from Vietnam to Iraq, creating domestic constraints on government's ability to initiate or sustain military action by mobilizing public opinion.
Public pressure against war. Despite its moral appeal and the undeniable power of nonviolent movements, pacifism has faced a number of criticisms. For instance, pacifists have sometimes been criticized for being cowards, or free riders who remain morally uncontaminated while benefiting from the security provided by a military and the willingness of others to fight and potentially die for their nation's safety.
The free rider problem.
They're accused of subscribing to the deluded belief that it's possible to have clean hands in politics when difficult choices must be made. But pacifism also faces deeper moral and philosophical difficulties. First, it's regarded as incoherent by some because if it's based on the fundamental right to life, that right can only be defended in certain dire circumstances through a willingness to use force to protect oneself or others from aggression.
Does the right to life imply a right to self-defense?
That's the argument. The argument here is that the right not to be attacked must implicitly include the right to defend oneself, even with killing force when attacked. The second difficulty concerns pacifism's prioritizing of avoiding killing above all else, which, critics argue, devalues other crucial considerations like liberty, justice, recognition, and respect.
Is life the only value? The value of life, after all, is intrinsically linked to the conditions in which people live. Is life under tyranny or extreme suffering truly living? This implies a necessary, often agonizing trade-off between avoiding killing and protecting other fundamental values.
A difficult balancing act.
It is precisely such a trade-off that has been used to justify humanitarian wars, where the moral costs of forcible intervention are balanced against the alleviation of immense suffering and the protection of human rights within a domestic population facing genocide or mass atrocities.
So sometimes intervention might be seen as the lesser evil.
That's the justification often put forward.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's recapitulate our journey. We started with war's enduring, even pervasive ubiquity throughout human history, explored its evolving definitions beyond simple violence, and dissected the myriad reasons it occurs across human, societal, state, and structural levels. We also examined how technology is rapidly reshaping its very nature, from blitzkrieg to cyber attacks.
And we delved into the profound and often agonizing debates about the morality of war, moving from the cold calculus of realpolitik through the intricate ethical demands of just war theory to the absolute rejection of violence by pacifism.
Right.
We've seen how even the most seemingly clear-cut principles become incredibly complex and debatable when applied to real-world conflicts like the war in Afghanistan, highlighting the immense difficulty of moral judgment in the fog of war.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners, in our interconnected world? It means that while the weapons and tactics of war may dramatically change, humanity continues to grapple with the same fundamental, timeless questions about conflict, power, and morality. The forms may evolve, but the struggle endures.
Indeed. And perhaps a final thought to leave you with. Considering the shifting nature of warfare, particularly the rise of hybrid and cyber conflicts that blur lines and reduce visible costs, and the ongoing debates about their justification, does the increasing ease with which wars might perhaps be waged without boots on the ground and with such blurred distinctions between combatant and civilian make perpetual peace more or less attainable in our interconnected world? It's a question worth pondering deeply.
A very provocative thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into War and Peace.